Hi, everybody. This is the Hungry Math Professor here. And today I want to talk about the first chapter of Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity by Richard Rorty. And the first chapter is called The Contingency of Language. So in this video, I'm going to specifically talk about the chapter on the contingency of language as well as the intro chapter. This book, Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, was published in 1989, which actually was the year after I was born. And Richard Rorty lived from 1931 to 2007. So he's a contemporary philosopher. And it's interesting because oftentimes in philosophy, we read people from, often long ago, but Richard Rorty is quite contemporary, and I really enjoy his ideas. And so I'm going to go through each of the chapters in this book and make a video for you. And we'll start with the contingency of language. This book in particular it represents some of his mature thought. He has other books that I might read as well, but this is towards the later end of his career, so it really represents his mature thought. And in the intro, what I want to the one thing I want to pick out and talk about here for you is he talks about how he thinks the philosopher should be what's called he calls a liberal ironist. And what he's trying to do here is say, there's this Hegelian idea of you have a synthesis and antithesis, or you have a thesis and an antithesis, and then you try to make a synthesis. And he's saying that he's not necessarily just critiquing Hegel, but he's saying like the goal should not be to synthesize like all these great philosophers into some distilled synthesis here, but instead to make sense for like a paradoxical tension between multiple points of view in philosophy. And this idea of paradoxical tension is my phrase, but I think it really represents what Rorty's trying to get at here. And I think it's an important idea that, when we start questioning the objectivity of truth, or whether we can describe truth with language, and we start wondering whether truth is really a good concept for us. Instead, we start to think about, well, maybe there's just gray area everywhere, and maybe what we need to do is create tensions between competing ideas. And the idea is that the tension between these competing ideas, each of these competing ideas has a space, a context where they make a lot of sense, or a perspective in which they're very valuable, but neither one of them is somehow correct. So that's why you want to create like a circle of tensions. These different like ropes are pulling against each other. And instead of saying this one's right and this one's wrong, you instead build this network of tension of ideas that you wrestle with continuously as you are, brought against new problems that you need to solve, or new people, or blah, 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 blah. And so I like this idea. And so let me read from Richard Rorty's words himself about the liberal ironist. So he says, he says, it sketches a figure who I call the liberal ironist. I borrow my definition of liberal from Judith Sklar, who says that liberals are the people who think that cruelty is the worst thing we do. I use ironist to name the sort of person who faces up to the contingency of his or her own most central beliefs and desires. Someone sufficiently historicist and nominalist to have abandoned the idea that those central beliefs and desires refer back to something beyond the reach of time and chance. So he's getting at this idea that like we should be liberal in this sense of like caring about humanity, caring about the suffering of people. Yes, 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 but not to the point where we start building a system of truth that tries to like systematize what it is, what's right and what's wrong in some like grand moral theory. He's saying that that's just never going to happen. And what draws us to dislike violence and dislike cruelty is something we feel inside of us as human beings. We should honor that, but we shouldn't try to build a theory about it, right? And so there's a tension there between these two views. And you might say, what should we do then? And he's going to say, I can't answer that question for you. There's a tension you have to feel, and then you will make an action yourself. He says, for liberal ironists, there's no answer to the question, why not be cruel? No non-circular theoretical backup for the belief that cruelty is horrible. Nor is there an answer to the question, how do you decide when to struggle against injustice and when to devote yourself to private projects of self-creation? He's saying there are no answers to these questions, but that doesn't mean you're not going to act. It doesn't mean you're not going to have values in the world. But he's trying to get us away from this idea that we should like build some firm foundation and systematize all of morality in order to figure out the answer. He's saying that that's not really going to fix the problem either. You just built a system which gives you an answer, but should it be any more trusted than what you just felt from before, right? Like, instead, let's live in the tension rather than deluding ourselves into believing that the system has given us the right answer. You just sort of forgot about the tension, but it's still there. I really like this. I mean, this is right up my alley. And he also talks about, if you've ever studied ethics and philosophy, there's a certain style of ethics where they give you these thought problems. Like you've probably seen like a trolley problem where, you can redirect the trolley to kill your best friend, or you can redirect your trolley to kill 100 people you don't know. Which one do you do? These kinds of things. And he's really making fun of that kind of thing. It's like, listen, come on, this is not how morality works. There is no calculus that tells you which is the better thing to do. It just doesn't exist. There's a tension there. And, if that ever happened to you, you would make a decision, and it is what it is. There's no objective answer to these things. The fact that these trolley problems are kind of silly, you should care about the cruelty either way. And, so he's trying to get us away from that. He's saying, like, when we overly systematize moral questions, that makes one into a theologian or a metaphysician. And again, in his eyes, these two peoples are making mistakes, different mistakes that have been made in the history of philosophy. Perhaps even saying a mistake is the wrong way to put it. It's just not where we're at now in the current way that we're using language, the current way we think about things. We're just not in the place, or he doesn't want us to be in the place where we're committing to being a theologian who thinks God tells us what's the right way to do it, or a metaphysician who thinks that somehow philosophy can like give us some grand theory that can tell us what to do, right? So now we move into chapter 1, where we're going to get at these themes again. And chapter 1's called The Contingency of Language. And in the first part, he sets up two different types of philosophers. Again, I'm going to read a quote from this part to give a sense of what he's saying. So he says, some philosophers have remained faithful to the Enlightenment and have continued to identify themselves with the cause of science. And then later on, other philosophers, realizing that the world as it is described by the physical sciences teaches us no moral lesson, offers no spiritual comfort, and have concluded that science is no more than the handmaiden of technology. So he sets up this dichotomy, and he doesn't use the words I'm about to use, but it's hard not to see the dichotomy through the lens of analytic philosophy versus continental philosophy. And I think that's basically the dichotomy that he's using here. He just doesn't use those terms, though of course he's aware of these terms. And the analytic philosophers are often accused of turning all of philosophy into mathematics, and so they're very much in the line with rationality and science and math. And then oftentimes the continental philosophers are accused with turning everything into poetry. And so they tend to emphasize the phenomenological experience and just what it is to be human and these kinds of things. And he's going to want to critique both of these things and try to draw us towards more of a pragmatic philosophy and something that he's going to think is more conducive to where we find ourselves now in the history. So in particular, he talks about Kant and Hegel in the history of philosophy, like as sort of making some or doing some justice to this problem by sort of devaluing science. But he kind of says that they do a half-assed job because they devalue science, but then they want to promote like something like mind or spirit or like the human essence or metaphysics as somehow above science. And he says like that was just a half-assed job. Like what we needed to do was not put anything up as like the truth, right? So just devaluing science, but then putting something else in its place is somehow not completing the project, right? And so he's trying to complete the project, of that he sees like Kant and Hegel of these idealists as starting the project. And he thinks we need to sort of complete the project of appreciating the contingency of language and just the fact that truth is not a meaningful or a useful concept for us as human beings, as we're going to continue to think about here. And so he has this idea that truth cannot be out there. And so he wants to question whether truth can be out there. He says, truth cannot be out there, cannot exist independently of the human mind, because sentences cannot so exist or be out there. The world is out there, but descriptions of the world are not. Only descriptions of the world can be true or false. The world on its own, unaided by the describing activities of human beings, cannot. So he's saying, listen, don't accuse me of denying reality or something like that. I'm not denying reality. Of course, physical reality exists. Of course, I'm not crazy to deny like what I experience in a common sense way. That's not what I'm doing. What he's denying is that I can describe it with language accurate enough to call it truth with a capital T. And he's saying we need to get away with from that, right? But of course, I'm not. Like physical reality exists. Sure, I come in contact with it all the time. I just can't describe it. I don't expect to ever be able to describe it in such a way to be calling it capital T truth. And I really think this is important. I think this is important for me as well to let this kind of thing wash over me. As a math professor, I really think, although I've been skeptical of absolute certainty and truth, I think my whole life in some sense, I think there's always been this part of me that wants to find it, right? And mathematics in some sense gives this feeling of the closest thing to truth and certainty that we have. And I think there's some truth to that. But when it comes to everything else, the kind of things that philosophy wants to talk about, I think we need to really embrace the contingency of things. And he talks about how there is no essence to things, right? So within the history of philosophy, there's a lot of talk about the essence of things. This comes very much from the Greek thinking. And he's saying that, this idea of the essence of things is also a mistake, right? Instead, we develop languages which describe the world a certain way, and essence is relative to the particular language that we're using to describe things. And so essence will change as culture changes, as languages change, because the way we see ourselves changes. And so there is no like ultimate essence or underlying essence. Again, this is he talks about how we need to get rid of truth talk. I'm using the phrase truth talk, but he's basically um, saying that, and I like this idea too. I am starting to think that like the most dangerous thing that we do as human beings is to use truth talk, but which I mean like when we delude ourselves into thinking we found some objective system which tells us what truth is, or we found some way of deciding on black and white truth. When we do that, and that truth talk can come in quite implicit and not always explicit ways, we again delude ourselves into thinking that we are somehow better than someone else in some objective sense. And that gets used all the time to enforce all kinds of violence against people, whether it's physical violence or whether it's verbal violence, or whether it's just using your power to subjugate people in all kinds of different ways. And I think, what philosophy needs to do, and what I think Rorty is saying in this chapter and the rest of this book, is that we need to sort of get rid of that and start to let wash over us these paradoxical uh, you know, tensions between ideas, and this liberal ironist that he talks about. Like instead of trying to find black and white truth, let's just try to set up competing ideas that are useful, and use those things and appreciate different people and different perspectives, even though we're going to make and stand up for our own values and things. And so in this part, he starts to introduce ideas of Donald Davidson, which was another contemporary philosopher who lived from 1917 to 2003. And Rorty is a big fan in this chapter of his theories on language. So he's going to use that. One thing I want to say about Rorty's writing style is well, first of all, he's a very nice writer. He's very clear, and it's enjoyable reading. But he also just constantly refers to all kinds of different philosophers from the history, the canon. And so I do think this is probably not easy to read if you're not familiar somewhat with, philosophy in general. I don't think you need to have read about all the philosophers that he mentions. I haven't read about all these philosophers, but I think it is helpful to have some sense of sort of the history of philosophy, because he's going to constantly refer to that. That being said, he doesn't do it in like a super technical way. So I suspect that you would probably get away with it, and you would probably just learn a lot about philosophy from Rorty as well. I suspect that actually you may not need to have read it. Of course, you'll get a deeper understanding if you have, but you probably can get away with not have reading a lot of these things, and you'll just learn a lot of cursory knowledge about these philosophers from Rorty. So either way, I think this is a great read and you're going to enjoy it. Um, but now when he starts to talk about language and Donald Davidson's theory of language that he likes, he's saying that the goal here is we're going to keep developing new vocabularies. He also likes to use Wittgenstein's ideas here as well. So he talks about developing new language games, and that's sort of the project of philosopher, or the project of just kind of leading us into a new adventure via some new language game. And he's saying like it's not so much, he refers to Thomas Kuhn, where there's like these different periods of normal science, and then you have these revolutionary periods when you go from one thing like Newtonian's theory of gravity to Einstein's theory of gravity, or you go from Aristotle's physics to Galilean physics, or Cartesian, all these kinds of things. um, he's saying that it's not so much that one language was better for describing truth. That's not what's going on here. But, the languages were more useful for the projects we were trying to do at that time. And because that language was more useful for what society wanted to accomplish, we developed a new language, or we adopted a new language, right? But we need to stop getting at this idea that somehow it's better, or it's objectively getting at the truth behind underlying physical reality or something like that. He wants us to drop those ideas. Instead, we just develop new languages, and those new languages propel us forward into a new space. And we go on a new adventure with this new language, and the goal is to develop new attractive vocabularies which inspire us to follow the lead into a new era of exploration. So he's saying if you see a problem that you want to try to address, then one way to try to do that is to try to develop a new language and try to see if people will follow you, right? And he also brings up this idea of linguistic therapy, um, which is an idea from Wittgenstein, that we have all these sort of philosophical problems that seem really deep. But he's like, sometimes those problems to like everyday people just seem so out of touch with life. And he's saying maybe it would be great if we just dissolved a lot of these philosophical problems. He's not saying that there are no interesting philosophical problems. He's just saying a lot of these philosophical problems just feel completely devoid of like any humanness, or like any real touch to the physical world that we care about, or the human experience that we care about. And maybe we should dissolve some of those questions, right? Like Wittgenstein would say, when we can appreciate how language works. Um, and he also kind of goes into this theory of communication, which reminds me of Wittgenstein's ideas as well. And I like to think of this as like, when I communicate, language is inherently imprecise. There's not a pinpointed meaning to the words I use. Instead, there's like a cloud of meaning in my way of saying it. There's like a cloud of meaning. And as long as my cloud of meaning is close enough to your cloud of meaning, then we can communicate and we can get things done in the world. But it's not like we pinpoint these words with precise meanings and you have the exact same meaning as I have. It just doesn't work that way. Instead, it just has to be kind of close enough, right? They just have to converge on each other, on passing theories to communicate, is the way he says it. And I think that is great. And he tries to get us to think of the history of language as a Darwinian process. It's not so much that we're like some grand march towards progress of like where God's trying to take us or something like that. It's a Darwinian process where we want to survive. In evolution, things are chosen for survival purposes, but it might not even be like the animal becomes better or becomes has more abilities or things like that. It just might be able to survive in an environment because it's just a nicer environment to survive. Like maybe some animal like moves around and finds an environment that's just a lot easier to survive in, then they may not need like great as good of eyesight as they needed when they were in some other environment, right? So the point is that evolution is not always choosing for like the most souped up animal, or the most technologically advanced animal. It's just trying. It's not even. I don't want to use words that make it sound like there's some God behind it, right? It's just that these animals have some drive to survive, and they will do the ones that do survive will keep going, and then those traits will be passed on. And he's saying we should think of language that way as well. It's not like language is getting at the truth better and better and better, and that's what progress is. He's saying no, it's just that people change, and what they care about changes, and the world that they inhabit changes, and so language has to change with it, like some kind of Darwinian evolution process. But if we somehow got ourselves into a world where it was just a lot easier to survive, maybe we could deal with a much simpler language. We wouldn't need such a complex language. Maybe like just to give this evolution analogy some ideas here. And then he goes on to talk about metaphors in a really beautiful way. And in order to talk about metaphors, he has to get at this idea of what does it mean, like what is meaning in this sort of Wittgensteinian sense, or also Davidson apparent. This, to have a meaning in this theory is just to have a place in a language game, right? So it's not like you have this pinpointed, precise definition of a word. Instead, what it means for a word to have a meaning is just that it has a place in a language game, right? There's some community of language users who have a place for this word in their game that they're playing. And so that's what it means for a word to have meaning. And then he says that metaphors do not have meaning. So when we use metaphors, we're trying to express something that doesn't have a place in the language game yet, which is why we have to kind of search and grab for ideas that can't quite be expressed. He says, it's not the case that a metaphor is just a fun way of like describing something that's already in the language game. No, no, no. If that was the case, like the person could just use the words that were already in the language game. He's saying the metaphor is to try to propel us forward. And he says that, metaphors are to be savored or spit out, right? There's something you feel, you taste like food, and it's not so much like something you systematize or make into a calculus. You either savor the metaphor and you think, "Ooh, that tastes good, that's beautiful," or you spit it out. You're like, "That's disgusting," right? And if the metaphor gets savored by enough people, then it lives on and it can become a part of a language game. It might even start to have a meaning because it changes society or changes us. And if it gets spit out by enough people, then the metaphor gets dropped and that line in the evolutionary process dies off and it's whatever, that's just how things go. It's neither good or bad. It's just how that particular evolution of language went down. I think this is really a nice idea about metaphors and how we should think of language. And he also points to the idea that like the Platonist and the positivist saw metaphors as just kind of silly, oh, it's just like the poet or the sophist is just kind of like having fun playing with language. And there's a time and a place for that, but us serious philosophers don't need those metaphors in that way. Or, they don't really get at the underlying truth or some platonic realm or something like that. And he's saying like that was not maybe the right way to think about a metaphor. And he says the romantics did the opposite thing, where they saw metaphors as like the ultimate thing, this mystical, beautiful, the only thing that matters. And they also kind of went too far in one direction. And again, he wants us to instead have this tension. Like metaphors are great, but they're not getting at truth, right? And they're not getting at some mystical, ineffable either. They're just useful and they're beautiful, and because we might savor them, or they might be ugly because we spit them out. But again, it's not about truth or falsity, and it's not about like some mystical and ineffable either. Um, it's more of this Darwinian process, as he says. And then he gets into this. He wants to promote this culture of Nietzschean metaphors. And so he says, a culture in which Nietzschean metaphors were literalized would be one which took for granted that philosophical problems are as temporary as poetic problems, that there are no problems which bind the generations together into a single natural kind called humanity. A sense of human history as the history of successive metaphors will let us see the poet in the generic sense of the maker of new words, the shaper of new languages, as the vanguard of the species. Yeah, it's great. He's promoting like the maker of languages as somehow that's the key, right? But he's using poet in a very broad sense. He's saying even philosophers should be poets. And when he says that there are no like grand philosophical problems that are persist forever, he's saying like in a particular language game, some philosophical problems are going to seem more important than others. And when our languages change or our culture changes or who we are as people changes, then the philosophical problems we find important will also change. And that's how it is. And the same thing is poetry. And in some sense, then we're all of us makers of ideas, scientists, mathematicians, poets, artists, so on and so forth, are all sort of, in some sense, working on creating new languages. And we're all poets in this sort of grand sense. And I know some mathematicians and scientists probably won't like this, but I must say I'm in love with this. I think this is great. And I think it's a very humbling way of thinking about how we are and what we do. And he talks about how intuitions are no more than platitudes intuition gets used so much in philosophy, in part because sometimes you just bottom out and you have no more argument. And so then oftentimes you place intuition into the argument. Wow, there's some intuition that we have free will, or there's some intuition that um, we have a spirit or something like that. But I mean, intuition is just some platitude, some way of just trying to make your argument seem more substantive than it is, right? And we should forget about intuitions as well. And I love this quote from the very end of the chapter where I'll end, where he wants us, the goal is to worship nothing, he says, right? So the line of thought coming from Bloomberg, Nietzsche, Freud, and Davidson suggests that we try to get to the point where we no longer worship anything, where we treat nothing as a quasi-divinity, where we treat everything, our language, our conscience, our community, as a product of time and chance. To reach this point would be, in Freud's words, to treat chance as worthy of determining our fate. In the next chapter, this is the idea. Don't worship any sort of black and white truth or any system or any sort of philosophical project. That's why we have to replace it with this tension, this paradoxical tension of ideas and just language as this evolutionary process. Again, it comes back to this idea that I'm a big fan of, that I think philosophy needs to teach us to become comfortable with the gray area of life. That a good philosophy does that, does not try to make the world black and white, because that's a lie, that's a delusion. Instead, it tries to make us comfortable with the gray area of life. That's what a good philosophy does. It helps us to embrace the uncertainty in life and become stronger because of it. Again, it doesn't mean we don't stand up for our values. It doesn't mean we don't care about things or create languages and so on and so forth. It just means that all these things are contingent, and they might seem black and white relative to something I care about. There's nothing wrong with that, but in some ultimate sense, it's all gray. It's all these just paradoxical tensions. I really like this chapter. I'm excited to read more Rorty. Let me know what you think. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope to see you at another video.